We're at the Doha Forum, and I'm here with Ben Jamal from the Palestine Solidarity Campaign Director. And we've just come out of a session on Palestine. We had the ambassador of Palestine UK, Hussam Zomlot, Daniel Levy, an analyst who was once an advisor to Benjamin Netanyahu, and there was a Chinese official and another expert on the panel. It was a very interesting session. And I have a number of thoughts on that, but I wanted to just get your sense of how the Palestine issue and the bombardment of Gaza has been covered here, Ben. What's your perspective on how Palestine, in my point of view, has been dominated the entire Doha Forum? What do you think?
I'd agree with that. There have been a number of sessions. Obviously, there's a broad range of issues that are being covered here, but it is true that the issue of what is happening in Gaza at the moment is hovering throughout, I would say, with a number of sessions where it has been the main focus. I think one thing that struck me in particular, on the very first morning, we had a presentation from Antonio Guterres, who I don't think was asked to come specifically to talk about what's happening in Gaza, but it absolutely dominated what he was saying, and he delivered a very clear message that he obviously was coming fresh from the failure of his attempt to get a resolution passed by the UN Security Council. He gave a very clear message that he would not be ending his efforts there. Obviously, there is a vote in the General Assembly. He acknowledged that's happening next week. He acknowledged that has no political weight. It doesn't carry the force of a resolution, but gave an indication he would want to try to bring it back to Security Council. The question he didn't have an answer to, of course, is, well, what do you do about the fact that the US will almost certainly employ a veto again? But the one thing that has struck me, I think, in terms of the conversations here, and I'm looking at this from a British perspective, in terms of how this has been addressed, it is resonating, but there has been a type of conversation here that is absent, I would say, from a lot of the political discourse in the UK, at least in terms of how our political classes are addressing this issue, and how much of the mainstream media is addressing it, which is here. People are reaching straightforwardly, including journalists putting questions to people like Antonio Guterres. You said we just come from a panel where there were representatives from China, Palestinian ambassador from the UK spoke. The person modulating that, a CNN journalist, went straight to questions about genocide, went straight to questions about the scale of the killing, the lack of accountability, the inadequacy of the mechanisms within the UN, that it is effectively powerless to act. All of that is sort of missing. It's not missing from understanding, but my experience as someone leading a solidarity organisation that's bringing hundreds of thousands of people to the streets marching, and all of those people are coming, and if you ask those hundreds of thousands of people why they're marching, they will say, I'm marching to stop wholesale slaughter. And they understand the scale of what they're witnessing.
On that, Ben, sorry to interrupt you. On that, the session we just come out from is how Palestine has gone global.
Yeah.
And one of the points that was mentioned was how Palestine has become an avatar for global discontent, for all sorts of injustices, inequality, and of course, directly related to genocide in Gaza. So you get a sense of that in the UK as well. So in your view, Palestine has grown global, and this is being reflected in the conversations here and also the events we see across the world, of course, in London as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two points, and the thing I was saying there, I think there is an understanding of, what happens if you allow violations of international law, impositions of unjust systems of power to run unchecked. So in the session we've just had, Daniel Levy made these points, which is, look, if you've been paying any attention to what Israeli leaders have been saying for decades, the current government is an extreme iteration of this, but the dynamic has been clear. We are going to continue to impose upon Palestinians a system of discrimination, of inequality that meets the definition of apartheid, and the world has tolerated that. And what we're seeing now is the end point of that. And Daniel also made this point, which is if you allow Israel not to face accountability measures, then it will do whatever it can. And at the moment, that terrain means if we can unleash a genocide, we'll unleash a genocide. So first of all, you have that dynamic that is fueling people's understanding, this sense of the sheer moral outrage at what is happening and the failure of our political leaders to hold Israel accountable. But then you have the second dynamic that you've just referred to, which is people having an understanding of how Palestine, in a sense, is at the center point and emphasizes at the moment what happens when you allow systems of power to run unchecked. And we see this. So, we had a moment of synergy on Saturday. Hundreds of thousands of marching. They were joined by people who had mobilized in the morning on the issue of climate justice and then came from that demonstration and marched to join our demonstration. Why? Because they see the synergies. They say, what has happened when you allow the powers in the world to run unchecked systems of capital that prioritize profit over the planet, and you end up with the climate crisis that we are now facing that will affect disproportionately the disempowered and the marginalized communities in the world. The global south understands this very acutely. And you see the same dynamic. What happens when you allow unchecked a system of apartheid to maintain itself, and you end up in a situation where we are normalizing wholesale slaughter? I was in Parliament last week answering questions from the Home Affairs Select Committee about our protests. What did they want to talk to me about? I tried to talk to them about why people are marching and about genocide. I kept getting closed down. They said, we're not interested in the politics of this. We're not interested in this. What they wanted to talk to me about is, what are the people who are coming on these demonstrations chanting? And why do they chant from the rivers to the sea? And isn't that a genocidal chant? Now, of course it isn't. But actually, what they're saying is we're concerned about the words people are using. We're less concerned about the reality of marginalized people who've been oppressed for decades, facing wholesale slaughter. And that's what's resonating. And you see it very, very sharply here. That disconnect between the reality of what is happening, people's understanding on the ground of that, that's why they're mobilizing, and the complete failure of the systems of power that have been constructed to deal adequately with that. There was a session this morning with Guy Ryder, the Undersecretary. He was held to challenge, and at one point he said something that expresses a truth, but it's quite chilling. He says, all we have is words. We don't have power.
That was a session on, I should just for our viewers, that was a session on, is multilateralism working for the Palestinians and generally, and how the UN has been a complete and utter failure. And Guy Ryder was asked questions, has the UN failed? Can the UN be a solution? And I think it was quite a heated conversation between the host and the UN official.
And she put to him, because he defended the position of the UN, he said, look, the Secretary-General has spoken up very, very boldly, and the CNN anchor said, but those are just words. And he said, well, words are all we have. Now, he was speaking to a truth, which is, as the UN Security Council is formulated, if you allow permanent members to exercise a veto, then it doesn't matter what is brought if they're going to exercise that power to stop something happening. And he's right. The words that have been used are the right words. What Guterres tried to do last week was the right thing to do, but the UN is powerless, and this is a fundamental problem. It comes back to the question that was at the center of the panel, I think, that we've just heard, which is accountability. That actually, if we are going to ensure, and this is, I think, the reality that we're facing. What we're witnessing at the moment, Hussam Zomlot in this session put it like this. He said, this is slaughter on an industrial scale that is happening on people's TV screens. And that's not unique in the world, but it's sort of unprecedented in our lifetimes, that we are watching wholesale slaughter, unfold on our TV screens, thousands of children being killed, and the message we're getting from our leaders is we don't want to stop that, or we are unable to stop that, because the way the systems of power in the world are constructed, we cannot stop it. You heard Keir Starmer a few weeks ago say it's not practical to talk about a permanent ceasefire. In other words, he's saying, well, the US isn't going to vote for that. So that's hot air. Now, what that is actually saying, and this is what is bringing people out onto the streets, is we must allow this to happen. Yeah. And the people coming out on the streets saying, we don't want to allow this to happen. This is unconscionable. This is not the world we want to inhabit. Now, I don't know any other mechanism. People say to me, what's the purpose of protest? I don't know any other mechanism to affect change than people mobilizing in huge numbers and putting pressure on the systems that exist to say, we're not going to accept this any longer. We demand change. And that's why I keep delivering the message, keep marching, keep protesting, keep boycotting, keep campaigning, because we don't have any other tools at our disposal other than to say we will not cooperate with these systems of injustice.
Yeah, I think that also ties in with some of the questions being asked about the UN. Of course, in the UK, protest is seen as the only mechanism through which we can shout out and express our discontent over what's happening. But globally, there's discontent over the UN, and UN seems to be here, at least on the stand. And there's a real call, I sense, from all the sessions I've been attending, to reform the UN and have the UN reflect the changes in the world from the Second World War and the balance of power that we see. So call for the UN is something, one of the key things here. And the other thing from the last session was ongoing discussion, what does the day after look like, or the morning after look like? And I think the important, which is the last question to you from me, how Hussam Zomlot addressed that question. We shouldn't be thinking about the morning after, we should be thinking about the now, which is to call for a ceasefire, and also have an understanding of the day before. What has it been like for the Palestinians? What is it that we're dealing with? And Levy made a good point. He pointed out that we should not be stuck on the two-state solution paradigm and really understand what Israel in its essence is about, what Zionism in its essence is about. We are dealing with a settler colonial project, an exterminatory project, as he described it. Unless we understand that and get our heads around that, there is no sense of talking about the day after, because the solutions we will come up with will be replicate some of the problems we've seen over the decades. So we need to understand the day before and to get our heads around that. I thought that was a really important point, because, as I said, everyone's talking about the morning after, the day after. That was in the first session and many other sessions. But I don't think people have understood what the Zionist project is really about, which is something Hussam Zomlot is trying to emphasize. Levy is also trying to emphasize.
Yeah, there's a number of things. I mean, one thing, first of all, going back to what you said at the start in terms of that what people have is the power of protest. The other thing I would say is people do have the power in democracies of voting, and there was a slogan at our demonstration on Saturday, which I would emphasize to people: no ceasefire, no vote. And I would say to people, take account at the moment of how, the people who are standing for election at some point in 2024 in a general election, what positions are they taking at the moment, and hold them accountable at the ballot box. Do not vote for anybody who has been prepared to greenlight the slaughter that we're seeing. But look, in terms of, I would say two things in relation to the themes of the last session, which is what about the day after? And as you said, Hussam said, look, we can't talk about the day after, we have to talk about the situation now. There's one thing I'd want to echo. What are we going to be dealing with, first of all, in relation to Gaza on the day after? Now, 1 week into this current situation, I saw a military analyst on Newsnight asked a question: how many Palestinians will be killed before Israel is under serious pressure to call a ceasefire? He gave an answer at the time chilled me. I found it actually impossible, despite everything I know, impossible to conceive. He said, he did a calculation, he said, this is how many they killed in 2014, this was the rate of killing then, this is the rate of killing now, so on that metric, then we should be looking at least 20,000 Palestinians. And I remember thinking, that's not conceivable. Yeah. It's not conceivable the world is going to stand by and allow 20,000 Palestinians to be killed. Well, we're already past that point now. And Israel is saying, the foreign minister said this week, we're not talking about more weeks of this, not even necessarily more months. We will continue until we've achieved all of our objectives. Now, you ask yourself this question, what about the day after? Now, genuinely, I think if anyone in that hall today had been asked the question, are these possible scenarios? Is it a possible scenario that more than 100,000 Palestinians might be killed? Nobody could genuinely say that's inconceivable. We're on the verge of major epidemics breaking out. If they do...
I mean, Levy did say we should prepare ourselves for the fact that it could get worse.
Well, it could get worse. And look, ask yourself this question. If somebody said to you, is it conceivable that what we're dealing with on the day after is that the bulk of the population in Gaza will have been expelled? Most people would say, no, none of the world's not going to tolerate mass ethnic cleansing on that scale. But I would say, really? Are you so certain of that in what we're seeing at the moment? When you look at the position of our political leaders, do you think that they might find a way of accommodating that? Or even conceiving of that as, well, that's a good humanitarian gesture. They've been taken to a safe place in the Sinai. So what is Gaza going to look like on the day after? What's going to be left of Gaza is something that we're not in a position to ask, and which is why the priority is to stop it now. Stop it now with every means at our disposal. But the second point, what is required on the day after? Well, we know the root causes of this. They haven't altered. The root causes are decades of military occupation and imposition of apartheid. This was the point Daniel was trying to make. He framed
and impunity, Western impunity.
And impunity for that. Impunity for it. So if you say, we're hearing a lot of rhetoric at the moment, even Keir Starmer's been saying, look, we can't return to the status quo ante. But what does he mean by that? Well, what he means is probably more rhetoric about a two-state solution, etc. The point Daniel was trying to make, and others, and Daniel made this point at the end of his presentation, which is, we have enwrapped ourselves in this narrative about a two-state solution. Ultimately, PSC's position, that's for the Palestinian people to determine. But the issue is one of rights. It is, how are rights being deprived? They are being deprived through a system of apartheid. That has to end. If a two-state solution means the maintenance of an Israeli state that practices apartheid against the 20% of its population that are Palestinian and continues to deny the right of return, how is that an acceptable outcome? So if anything is going to change, and if we're not going to be back here again in another 5 or 10 years, watching another outbreak of wholesale slaughter and the world racking its brains, how do we stop this? Then actually on the day after this, the priority now is to stop it, but then there has to be accountability. And accountability means we say to Israel, you are practicing a system of apartheid. We know how to deal with apartheid. We don't accommodate it. We sanction it, we boycott it, we isolate it until it's dismantled. It's that simple. And that requires action from governments, action from public bodies, and it requires popular pressure to say, we're not going to invest in companies, we're not going to spend our money on companies that are supporting this illegitimate system that disempowers an entire people. And that's the change we require. And look, there's nothing new there. Palestinians have been telling us for decades, every time I bring a Palestinian over to the UK to speak, people say to them, what can we do? They've always given the same answer. End your complicity. Take action to stop your government, your public bodies, your companies and corporations supporting this system of injustice that denies us our rights. Those are the fundamental truths. We just have to put them into place. And the fundamental thing from the hundreds of thousands of people marching is your power, actually your popular pressure is required not just now, but in the days after, when the bombs stop falling. We require you then to be putting your sustained activism to join the campaigns that PSC is running, so we create that popular pressure for change. I don't know any other mechanism to achieve that change than that.
Yeah. Thank you, Ben. I think we'll join for another review if we can. There's another session in the afternoon on Palestine, and hopefully I can have another conversation with Ben, and also looking forward to a number of other discussions with some of the other distinguished panelists here. So that's from Nasim here at Doha Forum and Ben Jamal. Thank you. Bye-bye.